मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं। इस अवसर पर मैं हमारे मंत्रीगण, शेरपा और सभी अधिकारियों का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं, जिन्होंने अथाक परिश्रम करके इसे सार्थक किया है और इसलिए वे सभी अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं। मैं अब मीडिया से मित्रों को रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूं कि अगर आप इजाजत दें तो हम आगे का काम करना चाहते हैं। आप सभागृह से बाहर जा सकते हैं।
So PM Narendra Modi there making the announcement, and we are expecting now. Let's quickly just tell you that there is a presidency press briefing about the proceedings so far through the day. There is a lot that's happened, plenty of pull asides. Prime Minister Narendra Modi already confirming the bilaterals with the UK Prime Minister and also the Japanese Prime Minister, and he's tweeted that there have been very fruitful, positive bilateral engagements on the sidelines of the G20 conversation. Plenty that is happening at this point, ladies and gentlemen, where there seems to be a consensus building even on the wording of the joint communique, which perhaps is going to be very critical in terms of the statement. Can the heads of state, all nations participating, can they unite to form and write out a language that holds true the spirit of G20, which largely stays clear of geopolitics and focuses on trade, focuses on development and focuses on issues that concern humanity, a human-centric approach? Will we be able to get that? There seems to be a largely an agreement on the same. More importantly, the inclusion of the African Union, 55 nations that come together into the fold as permanent members of the G20, significant development that has happened. How is that going to impact and how are nations going to react to this? There are other nations who thought that they would continue to lead these nations, but India is saying we'll just be the voice, we'll help everybody grow, and a huge vote of thanks which has already come. The spirit with which, the warmth with which you saw President Assoumani, who is the President of the African Union, embrace Prime Minister Narendra Modi before he took the chair, itself showed how much this means to the African Union. More importantly, a world that is changing, a fast-paced, fast-changing world, dynamic world which Prime Minister talked about. We are on the cusp of something phenomenal that's going to happen over the next 2 decades. The whole narrative of the world is going to change. A lot of the first world nations will now have to cede space to the emerging nations, because the emerging nations will contribute to 2/3 of the world's GDP. And should they have the first right of use of resources? These are all questions that are important. We have important news updates that are also coming through at this point. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also tweeted yet again, saying, speaking at the session 2 of the One Family, PM has said that he is addressing, and that was what the pitch was, where he had said that we will now work towards as working as one family, where he requested the media friends to come out while congratulating the organizers, congratulating the entire army of people who have worked at the back end to make this perhaps a world-class event, and saying, I thank you all for your efforts, because clearly the efforts are showing. Now we got Professor Salvatore Babones joining us live. Professor Babones, namaste and welcome to this broadcast. You've been following the developments very carefully. How important is this message of Sabka Saath, the message of inclusion, saying Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as he underlined this when he welcomed the African Union formally into the G20 as a permanent member?
The message is crucially important, and finally, we'll have something practical coming out of a G20 meeting. The G20 is not known for having practical results, even going all the way back to the global financial crisis in 2008 when it was first founded. Yet here we have the African Union being brought into the G20. That's very, very important symbolically. South Africa has been a member of the G20 from the beginning, but South Africa can't speak for the entire continent. That's 55 countries that are members of the African Union. Now, that said, the African Union is not as cohesive a governance grouping as, for example, the European Union. So the African Union, there will be internal disputes within Africa over the message that Africa will take to the G20 in the future. But this is a tangible benefit nonetheless that will propagate through to future G20 meetings and hopefully to future global governance venues beyond the G20 itself.
Well, we've just got news that this G20, India's G20 presidency has perhaps been the most ambitious in the history of G20. For you, let me ask you, what perhaps is the biggest box that you would like ticked, or has the inclusion of the African Union already ticked that box, Professor Babones?
Look, that symbolic box is really the best we can hope for. There's certainly not going to be a geopolitical consensus around the G20, even with Russia and China absent at the highest levels. Of course, they're both represented, but not represented by their top leaders. There won't be an ability to get a consensus around the table on anything really very tangible. So I think we should take away this African Union win as the big win. That said, this G20 meeting is not really about the G20. Let's face it, this G20 meeting is really about India. The star here is not the G20 or even the leaders who are present. The star here is not even Narendra Modi. The star here is India itself, the host country. This is India's coming out party, and I think everybody who's there is probably thrilled to be part of that. Joe Biden certainly is. Anthony Albanese, Australia's prime minister, certainly has cast it that way, and I think Indians should realize that as well.
Bilateral engagements are different, multilateral fora and multilateral understanding is different, the dynamic is different. Will India be able to emerge as the problem solver, Professor Babones? And if India is able to do that, does that mean then it gets a reserved seat at the high table?
India is already a regional problem solver and increasingly sought after beyond its region. But India's seat at the high table is not some kind of reward for India doing good work at the G20. India's seat at the high table, and I believe that next table is going to be the G7. India's seat prospectively at the G7 is really about the success of India, the size of its economy, and the importance of India in the democratic world. I mean, the G7 is the coordinating body for the economic governance of the free world. Well, with India as the fifth largest economy in the world, as the fourth largest democratic country in the economy in the world, soon to be the second largest democratic economy in the world, but certainly by the end of this decade, the G7 is looking, not very relevant without India. Now, India has been an observer the last few years. I strongly suspect that India, either at next year's meeting or the one after that, India will soon become an actual member, a formal member of the G7 grouping.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi using the tag of Bharat and not India, is that significant? Is that very important? How would you see that as a sociologist?
It is obviously politically relevant in India, and we're all waiting to see what comes of the special sitting of Lok Sabha after the G20 ends. Internationally, it really isn't that important. Many countries have different names by which they're known internally and externally. There was no controversy when Turkey started insisting on Turkiye as its name in international venues. Of course, what we know as the Ivory Coast is known as Côte d'Ivoire officially. Germany is Deutschland within Germany, but it's Germany for us, and it has different names in other countries. It's Alemania in French and Spanish. So for those of us outside India, what Indians decide to call themselves really is nothing we'll question. When they tell us that it's Mumbai, not Bombay, we just start saying Mumbai, or we may use Bombay for historical purposes, but it's not controversial outside India. Of course, inside India is where you'll have the big debate, and whatever Indians decide on this is something that the rest of the world will simply recognize and respect.
Professor Babones, please stay with us.